Let me go ahead and introduce you to Linda. Linda Beutler grows a variety of plants on a very simple city lot in the Sellwood neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. Her passion for clematis led to the publication of her first book, which was called Gardening with Clematis. It's currently now out of print, but that was followed by two more timber press titles. And the first one is Garden to Vase, and then 2016's Plant Lover's Guide to Clematis. Linda serves as a curator of the Rogerson Clematis Collection, which is North America's only accredited clematis collection, and she is the immediate past president of the International Clematis Society. In July of 2018, she was given a Golden Clematis Award by the International Clematis Society for her service to the society and the genus Clematis. She has been an adjunct instructor of horticulture at Clackamas Community College since 1996, and she specializes in herbaceous perennials, in other words, their cultivation and use, and cutting gardens for home and for commerce. Linda lectures internationally, thanks first to Canada and now to Zoom, on a variety of gardening topics. And she has made numerous appearances on Portland's Garden Time TV. So we'll take it away with Linda Beutler.
Thank you. So I have to do this one. Am I sharing?
Looks good.
Okay. So when we were discussing what I was going to talk about tonight, I mentioned this topic: why public gardens and why clematis? And the grain of this talk really goes back in history and started when I read this book, Founding Gardeners. My friend Lucy Hardiman read this and called me up and said, this was pre-COVID, I'm coming to your house and I'm bringing you a book that you have to read. And this talks about the fact that our founding fathers were gardeners. And in some cases, like John Adams, get your hands in the dirt farmers. But he wasn't as wealthy as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. And we have a history of naming plants after our founding fathers, and certainly there's lots of history for that all over the world. Famous people get plants named after them, but it links them to the places where they lived, and it's an honor that sort of follows them down the generations. And so I want to tell a little bit of a story that is told in the book. John Bartram was a famous gardener and had an arboretum just outside of Philadelphia. And he was also a delegate to our national constitutional debates as they were happening, starting in 1776 and beyond. And one weekend, as our Constitution was being negotiated on a Saturday, the delegates were going to leave hot and sticky old Philadelphia and go out to John Bartram's. But the Friday before they were going to go, the ratification of the Constitution had completely broken down. And at the last minute, there was a suggestion that our national representative bodies be divided into two bodies. There would be a House of Representatives, which would be based on population of each state. And there would be a Senate where each state, no matter its size, no matter its population, would be represented by two senators. so that in the Senate, it would be a more deliberative body and a body that was sort of always the same size, except as we took in more states, and where things could be considered and decided in a way that seemed more fair, because all of the states would have equal representation. And then you would have the House of Representatives, which would really be the people's house. It would be based on population, and it would serve the focus of the purpose of being more the people's voice. And so that suggestion was made, and it was sort of there on the table, and they were going to vote about it on the next session. But Saturday, all of the delegates went out, and the smallest states, Rhode Island and at that time Delaware, were really unsure about this compromise, and they just felt like they were very small. They would never have the population of a New York or of a Virginia, and which were the big populous states then. And so they went to John Bartram's garden, and what they saw was a garden full of plants from up and down the eastern seaboard. Franklinia, which I showed you the picture of just before, is native to Georgia. And here that was growing in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia, along with the amazing sugar pine trees from Maine, and plants from all up and down in between, but growing happily together in one garden. And the delegates from Philadelphia or the delegates from Rhode Island and Delaware were so moved by this that when the Continental Congress met again, they voted for the compromise, because if all of these plants are living together, then the citizens of the United States, no matter where they lived, should all be able to join together and be represented just as they were in John Bartram's garden. So that should let you all know just how important gardens are to the United States and to our history and to well-being of people, a sense of having a place where they can relax and see beautiful things and learn about how the plant world all sort of fits together and manages to grow together. So let's fast forward a few hundred years to the developing of a brand new public garden right outside the city of Lake Oswego at Lusher Farm. Lusher Farm was a dairy for most of its existence. The farmhouse was built in 1900. The barn was built as just a hayloft about 4 years later. And then right after, or just before World War II, the farm became a dairy, and it was the Lusher family dairy until the very early 1990s. And at that time, Rudy Lusher became too old to manage the dairy, and none of his children wanted to take it on. And actually, one of his sons had started their own dairy and didn't want to be commuting and handling dairies on two different sites. So the cows all went to the son's dairy, and Rudy approached the city. And up on the side of Cook Butte, and you can just see some roofs way off in the distance, a Street of Dreams went in. And Rudy very astutely first had the farm put on the Registry of Historic Places, so that the 23 acres that immediately surrounds the farmhouse has to always be kept in agricultural use. And then he approached the city of Lake Oswego and said, you need to buy this. You want a rural buffer between you and West Lynn. And my farm can be the beginning of that. So the city bought 43 acres of Lesher Farm, and right away they had the opportunity to buy the next farm over, the Lang Farm. And pretty soon they had created a rural beltway between themselves and West Lynn. And they decided, well, they have to keep that original 23 acres in sort of agriculture and horticultural use. And so that's how Lesher Farm Park was created. It's the only place where the city of Lake Oswego has community garden plots. We've got I think just over 200 community garden plots here for the whole city. Hotly contested, glad I'm not part of that. And we also have 11 acres of community supported agriculture through 47th Avenue Farm. So we have folks coming in every Thursday evening to pick up their boxes of vegetables. And then in 2004, they invited the Clematis Collection to join. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. And first we have to talk about our founder, Brewster Rogerson, a professor of English literature at Kansas State University, who in 1971 was having a house built for himself and went out to a local nursery thinking he'd like the idea of a vine-covered cottage and that he would plant some sort of flowering vine between the garage and the walk up to the front door. He bought 4 clematis, went home to research about how to grow them, and could find no information. And if you remember back to the 1970s and early 1980s, basically the only gardening books that were available were coming out through Sunset. You didn't have a lot of discussion of English gardens. There wasn't a lot of discussion of ornamental perennial gardening. And it was like gardening was waiting for a renaissance. And Brewster Rogerson, as you can see from this very urbane picture, was a Renaissance man. And so when he retired from teaching, he decided that zone 8 would be better than zone 4 for growing the most kinds of clematis. And he came west and settled initially in Eugene, and then realized that Portland was much more of a gardening hub. And he became familiar with Bob Gutman, who had Gutman Nursery and specialized in clematis and ground cover plants out in North Plains. And Brewster was able to move the clematis collection there, but they were all in containers of various sizes, from little rose pots full of seedlings to 7 and even 15-gallon plants that didn't get transplanted. But this is a picture of Brewster taken by Alan Mandel in the summer of 2007 out at Lesher Farm in our greenhouse. And people started coming from all over the world to see Brewster when we moved the collection to Lesher Farm. He had been a founding member of the International Clematis Society, and he had written 100 of the entries for their Clematis of the Month. So here he is with Washington nurserywoman Debbie Fisher. Debbie has a nursery called Silver Star Vinery up on Silver Star Mountain outside of Yakult. And both of them are good friends with Dr. Mary Toomey, an Irish plantswoman with 2 PhDs, one in botany and one in soil pathology. And Mary has made a couple of trips out here while Brewster was still alive to see the collection and watch it settle in from containers into being an actual garden. So why clematis? Clematis, if we think of the eastern seaboard plants uniting people in John Bartram's garden in 1782 or so, or whenever that was, and clematis, there are within one genus, a lot of similarities. Clematis are on all the major continents except Antarctica. They can be little tiny subshrubs like Clematis marmoraria that you see here. That's the smallest clematis in the world. It's considered a shrublet. So New Zealand is as close as we get to having clematis growing on Antarctica, and all of the weirdest clematis are in New Zealand. Clematis afoliata, which flowers but has no leaves. All of the photosynthesis happens in the stems. And Clematis marmoraria has been crossed with other species from New Zealand to create very free blooming but non-climbing draping plants such as pixie. There are clematis in Africa, not just vines that Tarzan is swinging on, but herbaceous perennial plants like Clematis triloba, which is native to the upland grasslands. You'd find it in Morocco and any upper elevation meadow plants, even right up close to the equator, but at an elevation that is more temperate. The steppes of Asia, Clematis integrifolia, another herbaceous perennial clematis. So people don't realize that not only are they vines, they are vines that are woody and persistent, which may be evergreen or deciduous. They are vines that are herbaceous, meaning that the entire vine dies back and then rejuvenates itself every year. Herbaceous perennials, we all know what those are. And the little shrublets like marmoraria, and there are some other clematis that are actually shrubs. What makes them all clematis is the knotty bits in the flowers. And clematis can be extremely hardy. When you hear a botanical name like Clematis siberica, yes, there are clematis native to Siberia. I just showed you Clematis integrifolia, which is hardy to zone 2. So is Clematis siberica. A lot of breeding with these types of clematis has been done in Sweden and also in Saskatchewan, Canada. Dr. Frank Skinner, and then his sort of protege, Stan Zabrowski, growing clematis and creating clematis that will be native on the Canadian prairie. And we have some pretty amazing clematis that are native to the United States. And I had the privilege with the International Clematis Society of visiting Virginia and going to clematis sites with the nurseryman C. Colston Burrell. And the shale barrens of Virginia, you can see the layers of silt that were compressed. This was all area that was underwater thousands of years ago. The water receded, and we can see each layer of silt as it was laid down, these thin, thin layers of silt compressed into shale. Who has colonized this? Clematis albicoma, Clematis viticalis, Clematis coactylus, sending their roots down in between the layers of shale and picking up the moisture that pools up under there in the heat. It's just amazing to me to see these sort of blasted areas where the Department of Transportation has come in, they've cut out roads. You can see how thin the shale is, and at the picture of the shale on the shoulder of the road, it just crumbles to bits. So it's very easy for the clematis to colonize that. And the only other plant to colonize the shale barrens is another herbaceous perennial, Heuchera americana. Clematis from Nepal, and that's an antique spelling of Nepal from when this plant was first found. It is winter blooming. It flowers in November and December. And we have had one in the ground here at Lusher Farm, 400 feet elevation. It's just outside, growing on a chain link fence outside our greenhouse. And it's been there since 2007. If you don't believe in global warming, I would invite you to come here to the Rogerson Clematis Garden and see plants that are supposed to be tender that are surviving outside in a way that no one could have imagined. But we're very happy that Brewster Rogerson was able to see this plant in full glory before he passed away in 2015. And another plant that is a holy grail plant for clematis collectors is Clematis texensis. It is because of this species and really excellent forms of this falling into the hands of British and French nurserymen in the 1890s that we have red, large flowered hybrids today. The red plants that you love, like Ville de Leon and Westerplatte, they're red because they have this species from Texas in their heritage. It is a great stud plant. It's also a great mother plant. And we couldn't call ourselves a clematis collection without having Clematis texensis. And getting this plant and growing it well was one of the early challenges to Brewster as a collector. And we're lucky to have his correspondence. He always kept a copy of every letter he sent to anyone. So not only do we have their responses, but we know what Brewster said to them in the first place in his letters. And there's lots and lots of early letters to nurserymen like Magnus Johnson in Sweden and Jim Fisk in England and Raymond Evison, who is still breeding plants to this day on the Isle of Guernsey. Brewster actually went and met him in 1977 and then subsequently sent him Clematis texensis seed in the hope that Raymond would have better luck with it than Brewster had had to that point. From Japan, the sweet autumn clematis. This is a species that's had a very rough life from a nomenclatural standpoint. It has been called Clematis maxio-witziana. It has been Clematis paniculata, which is simply incorrect. And there is a Clematis paniculata, and it's native to Tasmania, Australia, and New Zealand. The correct name for this plant is Clematis terniflora, and it's native to Japan. This is the sweet autumn clematis, but a lot of nurseries are still using up their old sweet autumn clematis labels that say Clematis paniculata. But Clematis terniflora, and we happen to have not only the green form, but we have a variegated form that Dan Hinckley brought back in the 1990s from a nursery in Japan. They had collected it in the wild. And I went up to Heronswood and I bought myself one. And I bought one for Brewster Rogerson and gave it to him. And mine died, but Brewster's lived. And if you know the history of Heronswood, you know that at one point, the nursery and garden were closed down. Dan Hinckley and his partner, Robert Jones, had sold it to Burpee. They were continuing the garden. Burpee was continuing the garden, but they were using it as a source of new plant introductions. The garden wasn't maintained, and they didn't do anything with the variegated sweet autumn clematis, and it went into decline. Meanwhile, we were trying to propagate it here, and we've discovered that it roots very easily from cuttings, but never forms any top growth. So one year I decided I'm going to try to grow it from seed. We planted 100 seeds from that original plant. Only one of those seeds was variegated, but we knew it from the instant it sprouted. Its seed leaves were variegated. So we tossed out all the others and saved that one. And that seedling is even more variegated than its parent. And when we save seedlings from that first seedling, 50% of the seedlings are variegated. So now we have a means of propagating it, and every few years we start another batch of seed, and we toss out the green ones and we keep the variegated ones. So the collection is represents here species from all over the world. Where do the large flowered hybrids come from? They come from large flowered species. And this is one of the real founders of the species, Clematis patens. It's native to China. Some people believe it's also native to Japan. Some people choose to believe that the Japanese got it in China and naturalized it in Japan. We're talking about events hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So there sort of really isn't any way to know exactly anymore what the true native range of Clematis patens is, but it also grows up into Manchuria. So it's very hardy. It's hardy to zone 4. People don't realize, because they look exotic, they don't realize that the large flowered hybrids are actually very hardy plants. But those hybrids come from somewhere, and this is one of the founding species. And it was used to create these old timers. And this is another function, like John Bartram's garden. Another function of the Rogerson Clematis garden is to act as a living museum where you can come and see the original hybrids, the original species, and then the hybrids that were created from them. And in some cases, you can follow the generations down the years through the breeders to look at our modern clematis and see that really we haven't stretched things all that far. Clematis vitacella and Clematis florida are two other founding species of the modern hybrids that we grow. And here you see them combined in one hybrid, Venosa violacea. This was created by the Lemoyne Nursery in Lyon, France in 1883. It happens to be my personal favorite. I just think that is absolutely beautiful. It's been my favorite almost as long as I've been growing clematis myself. And I love how long blooming it is and how interesting the flower is with that veining that all sort of runs together when you get out to the edge. The dark stamens are really give it a focus. So enough, that's my favorite. So do try to grow it, but it is a cross from two founding species, Clematis vitacella and Clematis florida. And now we've had a look at where clematis are native to, and we'll look a little bit at where they've been bred. This is Nadezhda. This was bred, if that's the Russian word for hope, bred at the Natitsky Botanic Garden in Kiev, 1965. As it turns out, during the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain, clematis were being bred like crazy in Kiev, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And when the Berlin Wall came down, clematis came tumbling out. And we've had a chance to be a part, because of our unique history and the timing of when Brewster Rogerson was collecting plants. We've had the unique opportunity, in the case of this plant, Helena Knoll, to return to Poland a cultivar that was bred there and then lost. A nurseryman named Szczepan Marszynski, who has been a tremendous friend of the Rogerson Clematis garden, was creating an heirloom or a sort of archival garden of the plants introduced by Vladislav Knoll and brother Stefan Franczak. And this plant is named after Władysław Noll's daughter. But whenever Szczepan went to look for it in Poland, he could only find it in lavender, and every description of it, and Noll's original description of it, was white. He contacted Brewster and I, this would be in about 2007, and said, do you have it? May I see a picture of your plant? So we sent him a picture. He said, that's it. How do we get Halina Noll back into Poland? So in 2009, I had propagated it. We had 2 mature 2-year-old plants and then 4 well-rooted cuttings that our then president, Sally Geist, took to the International Clematis Society conference in France and Switzerland. Szczepan met her there and got Halina Noll, and Halina Noll was reintroduced to Poland. And let me see, how would you know Władysław Noll? His probably the introduction of his that you would know the best, widely available in the United States, is Niobe. Niobe is burgundy red, very dark, has a very long period of bloom, starts early, might take a little rest during the height of the season, but then it's one of the last large flowered hybrids to stop blooming in the fall. It, in spite of the cold weather and the shortening days, it just keeps going and going and going. So that's one of Noll's introductions. How that came into the trade was he was friends in the 1950s and 60s with a nurseryman named Jim Fisk, who ended up being one of Brewster Rogerson's best friends. And Noll and Franczak both took up the habit of sending Christmas gifts or birthday gifts to their nephew, Mr. Fisk, in England. And the Russians who were who Poland had to answer to while they were behind the Iron Curtain, never realized that these plants were getting out into the trade through Jim Fisk. And so in the case of Poland during the Cold War, we knew that there were clematis being bred there, and we knew who was doing it. But in Estonia, Uno Kavistik was the breeder there. We had no idea of the incredible work he was doing. And the same with the botanists and horticulturalists in Kiev. So it was very exciting to see these plants emerge. And it was very exciting for us to be able to send this Halina Noll back to Poland. And in the early 2000s, Brother Stefan Franczak was a Jesuit priest, and he maintained gardens in the middle of the archdiocese, this huge big office building for the Warsaw Catholic Archdiocese, and in the middle of it is a garden, and the garden was tended by Brother Stefan. He bred iris, and there's a picture of him in his iris garden, and that picture of him is mounted in the iris garden in his garden. And then you see him with his clematis called Westerplatte, named after the sign of a great, or the town where there was a great Polish army victory. And just before he died in 2007, 2008, the Archdiocese had decided that they were going to literally pave paradise and put in a parking lot. They were going to convert Brother Stefan's garden into parking for the Archdiocese. And Szczepan Marszynski, this younger clematis breeder, contacted the International Clematis Society, and the Archbishop of Warsaw received 127 letters and emails from all over the world, talking about Brother Stefan, his clematis, how he had taught us all Polish history based on the names that he had named his plants, and how he had kept the spirit alive of Poland as an independent country, simply by naming his clematis what he named them and getting them out into the trade. And so the Archbishop called Szczepan Marszyński and he said, we had no idea. And we don't think Brother Stefan, who was very elderly at that point, we don't think he had any idea, but we are going to restore his garden and we are going to make it a World Heritage Site. So in 2015, the International Clematis Society got to go there and be part of the dedication of Brother Stefan's garden. And unfortunately, by then he had passed away. And so speaking of dedications, this picture was taken of Brewster Rogerson in the garden in a very rough state back when all of our paths were wooden chips because we could get them for free. But one of our members, Colby Lamb, created and calibrated and machined our sundial. Here he is explaining it to Brewster. And earlier that year, in January of 2011, Brewster and I had been going through his archive and looking at some of his earliest letters. And it was then that we found the letter written in 1975, where he says, it's hard for me to believe that I've gone from buying 4 clematis in 2000 or in 1971 to being a collector. And Brewster looked at me and he said, I guess that's the truth. He said, I always think of 1975 as being when the garden started, or when the collection started, but that's when I started calling myself a collector, but I was already collecting. I was already, and I started in 1971. So we instantly decided that that was 40 years on the dot and we needed to have a party, and we knew that Colby was making us a sundial. So we had a dedication ceremony then, but if you do the math, you'll realize that this year is our 50th anniversary. And of course, Brewster was 94 when he died in 2015. It was always unlikely he would make it this far, but we are partying as much as we can with COVID restrictions. We have big events planned throughout the year, and especially for our members. And here's a picture that everybody would have seen of Brewster and I at least once a week walking through the garden together. I would go and get him. In this case, we're just about to have one of our volunteer picnics. This picture was taken in August. So you have Brewster looking very dapper in his black slacks and his white cardigan. And I'm about to run into the office and change clothes. But I had been planting all day so that things would be looking really good for the volunteer picnic. And someone took this picture of he and I wandering along together, conferring, commenting, marveling over the very young garden. So what do we do here at the garden now? We do a lot of education. Not only do we have classes that public can sign up for, but we also have a cooperative work experience relationship with Clackamas Community College. And we've had about 15 students, and we're not through yet. We're always willing to take more students, helping us refine what we know about clematis, and they learn more. They learn more about working in a public garden, because we do think of things a little bit differently than you would if you were just a private gardener. And we're getting very interested in monitoring our pollinators and the various kinds of wasps and bees and other sorts of pollinating insects that visit our garden, not just the clematis, but all the different kinds of plants that we grow. So this was a new bug to us last summer, the grass carrying wasp. who started making its nest in the bamboo stakes that we use to tie clematis up for our sale plants. So that was really fun to meet a new character who was sort of exploiting the garden in a whole new way. And white-faced bumblebee and your basic honeybee. And I took this picture out in our test garden. And if you look at the Oregon State University, what is it, pest control handbook from 2020, you'll see that this picture that I took ended up being on the cover. I happen to be married to the publishing editor, so he knew this picture was around and put it on the cover. But this is what you can do with a macro lens. And another thing that the clematis garden does is that we preserve the unusual and we strive to get it back out into the trade. We're not a competitive entity. We're not trying to have more clematis than anybody else. We don't want to be the only ones that have something, because then if we lose it, it's totally lost. But this is Duchess of Waverly, which was actually introduced from a nursery in Milwaukee, Oregon in 1961. In about 1975, 1976, Brewster was invited up to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. They had just gotten a lot of new clematis from Arnold's nursery in Milwaukee. And Brewster took cuttings of Duchess of Waverly, and Waverly is spelled the way Americans spell it, with the L-Y instead of L-E-Y, just like the Waverly Country Club. And the nursery wasn't too far from the Waverly Country Club. And Brewster took cuttings and has had cuttings and grown plants of Duchess of Waverly in his garden, in his collection ever since. And if you are one of our truly outstanding volunteers, every year our volunteer of the year gets a plant of Duchess of Waverly. And we have shared this with Brushwood Nursery in Georgia. We've shared it with Joy Creek Nursery, and they have it. And we keep saying, you guys need to propagate it and get it out into the trade. And they say, well, that's sort of your signature plant. And it's like, no, get it out there. We want everybody to have it. It's really beautiful. And it's just amazing to me that this cultivar went from Oregon to Minnesota to Kansas, back to Oregon, and is now across the river from where it actually started. So that's who we are. We applied for accreditation with the Plant Collections Network originally in 2009, but at that point we didn't even have half of Brewster's collection in the garden yet, and I was only paid for 8 hours a week, and we only had a 5-year lease with the city of Lake Oswego. Well, we have made an amazing garden here. Lake Oswego loves us. They want us to be here for another 30 years. I am now paid for 60 hours a month, and that'll be increasing in July. And every clematis that we own that should be in the ground is in the ground, except for the very newest ones that are too young to get planted yet. So the American Public Garden Association granted us accreditation in January of 2018. And that's really kind of the end of the story. We continue to get more plants. We continue to share more plants with interested nursery people, swapping plants back and forth. I might just mention that in the picture here of our modern garden, where we have clematis that are fairly new to the trade, that big willow that you see in the back came down in the ice storm in February. And actually we're looking at it right in the direction that it fell. So about 2/3 of it fell this way and 1/3 of it fell back into the unused pasture. And so that was a cleanup job, I can tell you. But other than seeing where the stump was ground out and there's a little pile of wood chips now, we've done all the repairs and we're just waiting for the clematis to bounce back and start climbing up their new fencing panels. And we did have to replace a couple posts, but all things considered, we would have liked for that not to have happened, but we were able to recover from it pretty fast. So public gardens, we've always had them in the United States, and we would encourage you to come and visit one of the very newest ones, just south, come on down the 205 freeway, take the Stafford Road exit and head north. And at the second roundabout, come on to Rosemont and you'll see us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Linda. That was fantastic. Somebody commented that that was great history and she's going out to buy some clematis for her garden. So
Good.
you've inspired someone already.
Great.
There is another question that asks, are there types of clematis, excuse my pronunciation that last time around, are there types of clematis that can be used as ground cover?
Yes, there are. And this is something that is happening a lot in European public gardens. They're taking the herbaceous perennials. The sun is now coming right in my office here. So that's better. So I'm a little more lit up here. So they use the herbaceous perennial clematis that tend to be sort of some of the taller, more sprawly ones that don't cling, but they plant them so that the end growth covers up the crowns of their neighbor so that you don't see the sort of stemmy bits at the base of the plant, and they all run all over into each other. So that's one way that the herbaceous perennial clematis are used. But if you have a climbing clematis and you don't give it anything to climb on, it becomes a ground cover. And there are certain varieties of, especially of the large flowered hybrids, where the flowers are very up facing. So if you I'm talking about something like the President, an old classic, but if you let that plant get really tall, you're looking at the underside of the flower all the time. You're not really seeing the top. So if you don't put anything near it that's really tall, or if you just give it low shrubs that are sort of like, think of them as speed bumps for the vine rumbling along, then they make a great ground cover. Another thing that I've seen just in Clark County is, and I haven't heard from him in a long time, but there's used to be a wonderful garden owned by a guy named Richard Clark, and Richard Clark made amazing bird houses, bat houses, butterfly houses. And we used to get together, a bunch of us clematis folks, and we would go up and visit Richard's garden. And I think in 2001, we took the International Clematis Society there before this garden was even dreamt about, really. And so Richard would grow tons and tons and tons of tulips and bulbs. And then rather than have his garden look really awful as the foliage died back, he would grow the subshrub clematis. There's one that's really popular right now called Mrs. Robert Bryden. They have big coarse leaves. They form a woody base like a fuchsia, but then the new growth is a little softer and it's trailing, but it's not climbing. So Richard would grow these, and as the tulips are dying back, this beautiful big foliage of the clematis is coming on, and then those clematis have small flowers sort of in little clusters, and they're a kind of a sky blue, almost ice blue, very pale blue. But he would have just this sea of blue clematis and these big, lovely, sort of rough textured green leaves. And you wouldn't ever know that there were oodles of ugly tulips foliage dying back underneath where the clematis had covered it up. And I think I tell the story of that in my first book, Gardening with Clematis, and how Richard did that and how I thought it was just brilliant. Because it saved him having to, to dig up the tulips every year, or move them out of the way, or grow them all in pots and sink them in the ground and lift them up. And it just made it all a much more low maintenance sort of situation. And here at the Rogerson Clematis Garden, we have an area called the front bank. When you drive in, there's a public pathway that crosses the driveway right away when you turn into the farm. And just to your left is an embankment that comes down to the public pathway that is our gravel garden. And the clematis there like it hot. It's a south exposure. And basically, once the sun is past the scarlet oaks that we have on the driveway, so basically from noon or 1 o'clock through till sunset, these plants are in full sun. And we have planted the species there and the hybrids of those species. A lot of them American native plants from the Southeast. I showed you the shell barren plants. That's where we put them. The ones that are vines, we just let them crawl down over the rocks and the gravel, because if we put them up on structures and they're also up on an embankment, then they're just way up where they're just color and you can't really see the form or texture. But if they're coming down the embankment right at you at the ground plane, you can look right into them, and it's really wonderful. So the answer to that question is a resounding yes. And it's just a matter of figuring out which clematis you want to try to use in a given situation.
Wonderful, thank you. Are there some clematis that do well in the shade, and can you, if so, list a couple that you think are particularly good?
Okay, so on our website, if you go to rogersoncolematiscollection.org, and if you go to About, underneath that, you'll see resources. And under the resources, you'll see our information sheets on clematis care. And we have a whole information sheet that was Brewster Rogerson originally wrote, and then we've updated it with more newer varieties about growing clematis in partial shade or for north exposures where they would really only get sun on the longest days of the year. And there are some subtle colored, large flowered hybrids that do so much better in partial shade. They grow well, but their color is so soft that if you put them in a west exposure, for instance, they could survive it. They wouldn't mind it, but the color fades. And a lot of the striped clematis, like Dr. Rupel and Bee's Jubilee and the classic old Nellie Mosier, they look really ugly after they've opened after 2 or 3 days in the sun. And you really don't see that vibrant pink color with the red bar. All of that style of clematis really, really do better in partial shade. And you'll still get nice bushy plants. My favorite for partial shade is called Silver Moon. And it's the softest silvery lavender color. It's just really, really gorgeous. And so we have the heirloom garden wraps all the way around the farmhouse. So that includes the east side and the north side. And we have found that Duchess of Edinburgh, the classic big old double white, flowers just as well in partial shade as she does on the sunny side of the house. We've got 3 different specimens. 2 of them are in, one of them's on the east side of the house, so it really only gets direct light in the morning. One's on the north side and grows right up into rhododendron, which has worked really well. And then we have another one that is around in dappled shade under a Cornus Florida rubra on the west side of the farmhouse. So it's in the warmest position, but it's still getting dappled shade and not necessarily hot afternoon sun. So that's basically any of the striped clematis like Nellie Mosier, Silver Moon, or any of them. There's Louise Rowe is another one that you can sometimes find with a very pale lavender blue color. And then a lot of the doubles, especially the older sort of antique doubles. And the great thing about Duchess of Edinburgh is that she's double every time she blooms. So if you accidentally prune her at the wrong time, it doesn't matter because the flowers are always going to be double and you haven't cut off too much of the old wood for her to be double. So those would be my recommendations. But like I say, it's a PDF you can download and take a look for yourself at some of the clematis that do well in partial shade.
Thank you, Linda. And I think we have time just for one more question. This person's asking, they have a clematis in their backyard and they want to gather some seeds and grow them in a pot. Do you have recommendations on how to collect the seeds and how to propagate them from seed?
I sure do. First of all, we do a seed starting class, clematis seed starting class, and we usually do it the first weekend in November. And one of our site manager, Susan Toller, loves growing things from seed, all kinds of things from seed. So she joins me. The large flowered clematis, you're not going to get exactly what you planted because they're sort of complex hybrids. So it's going to be, you're rolling the dice when you grow the hybrid clematis from seed. You might get a couple that are really strange and weird. You might get the next big thing, and you might get a few seedlings that look like the seed parent that you took it from. And so what we do is we get like those little mesh jewelry bags and cinch them around the seed head when we pick out a seed head we want to save. And that way, if the seed starts to come off the receptacle, it's still held together in the little bags. And then to clean the seed, we simply snap off the seed tail. The seed tail is there to provide a plume that helps the flowers blow around. It also helps them catch on to birds' feathers, and it's like Velcro, catches on to the fur of large mammals. They go bed down for the night, they lick their fur and clean it. The clematis seeds come off, and kaboom, you've got another bunch of clematis blooming in the wild. And so that seed tail isn't necessary for the germination, and it can give you it can rot in the soil and then rot the seed. So we take the seed tail off. And then with the large flowered hybrids have big, large seeds. They're like 1/4 of an inch, basically long and across. And we actually soak those in water for about 5 days. And then after 5 days, we can peel off the outer coating of the seed that's called the pericarp. And then you can either plant the kernel that was inside the pericarp. You can just plant that in a little 2x2 pot with a little bit of seed starting mix, or we start them in bags of moist perlite. And this is a method that we saw in Japan, and then a couple of our CWE students perfected it. A quart Ziploc bag, 2 cups of propagation grade perlite, and a 1/2 cup of water. That's going to seem like not enough water, but it is enough. And you put the seedlings in there. You put them in a dark but warm place and check on them every few weeks. And once the first root or radical is 1 inch long, and especially if it's starting to also put up leaves, you pull them out and pot them into a pot, and off they go. So you can start them in a seedling pot, or you can start them in the perlite. We have found that with the kernels that we've taken the pericarp off, just taking the pericarp off increases germination percentage and speeds it up. So we like to use that method, and we like to use the perlite because it takes up a lot less room. And so we check, we use long-handled bar spoons. Barware is very important as garden tools. We use long-handled bar spoons to lift those seedlings out of the perlite. And then we use chopsticks to drill a hole in our seed starting mix to put that infant plant down in the seed mix. And then we water them from the bottom. And we also cover those seedlings with #2 chicken grit around the seedlings. And that pretty much prevents any damping off that we might be worried about. And water them from the bottom. That also helps prevent damping off. And then as soon as they fill up that pot, we move them into a bigger pot. Finally, they're in a gallon. And once they're in a gallon and they've filled up the gallon, then we're ready to put them in the garden.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
You bet.
Linda.
If you take the class, we provide everything. We provide the seed and the bags and the perlite, and you'll get to see how we do it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for spending the evening. That was wonderful. And we really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks. I hope you guys will come down and have a visit.
Sounds good. And I just want to remind folks that we'll be putting the recording on our website, Clark County Extension Master Gardener Program. So you can check that out there. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Linda.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.